Snow was coming down hard that Christmas Eve when I pulled into the narrow driveway behind my father's house in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. My shift at the Target store had run late again, and my hands were still aching from lifting boxes. But the message from my grandfather had cut through my tiredness the moment I saw it. He wanted me to come to my father's house right away. No explanation, no hint of why he had suddenly flown across the country. Only that firm, familiar tone that always meant something important was waiting. I stepped out of my old sedan, and the cold bit straight through my thin jacket. Light spilled from the windows of the house, warm and golden, but it did nothing for the knot tightening in my stomach. I hesitated before walking up the steps. Every year I told myself I would skip this family dinner, and every year I came anyway, hoping something might feel different. It never did. Linda opened the door before I could knock. She wore a dress that looked like it belonged in a magazine. Her expression froze for half a second when she saw me, like she had forgotten I existed until the moment I appeared at her doorstep. "You made it," she said, forcing a smile that vanished as soon as she turned her head. "Come in, I guess." The warmth inside the house almost startled me. The smell of glazed ham and cinnamon filled the air. Garland wrapped the banister and soft Christmas music played from the living room. It all would have felt comforting if not for the fact that none of it had anything to do with me. I was the outsider, the extra piece no one quite knew where to put. I stepped into the dining room, and that was when I saw him. My grandfather, Walter Hale, stood from the head of the table with a look of real joy breaking across his face. He looked older since I had last seen him, his silver hair thinner, his posture not quite as strong as I remembered from childhood visits to Seattle. But the warmth in his eyes was the same. "There he is," Walter said as he came toward me and wrapped his arms around me with surprising strength. "Evan, I have been waiting for you." The sound of his voice thawed something inside me. I had not realized how much I needed that hug until it happened. For a moment I forgot every harsh word, every cold look I had grown used to in this house. My father, Mark, sat stiffly at the other end of the table with a glass of wine in his hand. He gave me a nod, nothing more. Tyler, my 19-year-old half-brother, glanced at me from behind his phone and barely acknowledged me, the usual welcome. I took my seat near the end of the table while Walter remained standing. He looked around at each face, smiling like he had come bearing wonderful news, the kind of news that made people lean in, curious, excited. And then he looked straight at me. "Evan," he said, "did you like the gift I left for you? The one worth $3,200,000. The fork slipped from my hand and hit the plate with a sharp sound that made Linda jump. I stared at him, not sure I had heard correctly. It felt like time stopped for a second, like the house itself had sucked in a breath. "I am sorry," I said slowly. "I do not know what you mean." The room fell into a strange silence. Not quiet, not calm. A silence weighed down with something brittle, something waiting to break. Walter blinked at me as if I had told him the sky was green. He looked at Mark, then back at me with growing confusion. "You did not get it," he said, his voice quieter now. "Not even a message. Not one document." Linda cleared her throat. She sat straighter, smoothing the fabric of her dress. Her voice carried that familiar cheerful tone that always meant she was about to say something she did not believe. "Evan has always been very independent," she said. "He likes doing things on his own. He probably misplaced whatever you sent." I felt heat rise in my face. Misplaced. As if I was careless enough to lose millions of dollars in paperwork. As if I was someone who had ever even seen that kind of money in my life. Walter did not smile. He turned toward my father. Mark shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening. He kept his eyes on his wine glass, like he could disappear into it if he stared hard enough. "Dad," I said carefully, trying not to let my voice shake. "What is he talking about?" My father let out a slow breath, a long one, like he was buying himself time. Then he lifted his eyes to his father. "We did not want to overwhelm him," Mark said. "He has been figuring things out on his own. We thought it was better not to put pressure on him with something that big." I felt my heartbeat pounding against my ribs. Pressure, that was the word he used. Pressure, not theft, not deception. Grandpa lowered himself into his chair, but he never took his eyes off my father. They were sharp eyes, old, but sharp enough to cut through stone. "Evan," he said, "where are you living right now?" My throat tightened. I swallowed hard. "My apartment on East 3rd Street, same place as always." The room reacted even though no one spoke. Tyler's phone lowered an inch. Linda's fingers tensed on her napkin. Mark's face lost another shade of color. Walter looked like someone had hit him. "You are still living there," he said. "In that place you can barely afford. Working those shifts, that is not what was supposed to happen." A chill ran down my arms despite the heat of the room. I had no idea what he meant. Not yet. Before I could ask another question, Walter placed both hands on the table. The gesture was calm, but the energy in the room shifted. Even Linda sensed it and sat back. "I transferred $3,200,000 to a trust in your name," he said slowly. 2 years ago, it was meant to secure your future. The documents were sent here because you were still listed under this address. I was told the trust had been activated, that you had moved into the property tied to it, that you were doing well." Every word felt like a stone dropping into a deep lake, sinking fast. I stared at him. My voice barely came out. I never saw anything. I never even heard about any trust. For a moment, no one breathed. Then Mark spoke, his voice rising a little too quickly. "Dad, this is not the time to talk about all this. It is Christmas, and we do not want to start drama." Walter turned to him with a calm so sharp it was frightening. "Mark, I asked you to manage the paperwork until Evan was ready. That was all, nothing more. So tell me now, why is he still living in poverty?" The knife hit the bone. My father opened his mouth, shut it again, and glanced at Linda. She gave him a look I had seen many times. A look that said, "Fix this before it gets worse." But it was already too late. Walter pushed back his chair and stood again. This time there was no joy in his expression. Only disbelief mixed with something deeper, hurt. "Evan," he said quietly, "get your things. We are leaving tonight." The air in the room cracked like ice. I looked at him, then at my father, then back at him. I had no idea what was waiting beyond that door, but I knew something huge had just begun, and there was no stopping it now. I felt the room tilt slightly as I stood there, caught between my grandfather's steady voice and the stunned faces staring at me. No one moved for several seconds. It reminded me of the moment right before a storm hits, when the air thickens and everything seems to hold its breath. Linda was the first to break the silence. She pushed back her chair with a soft scrape and stood, smoothing her dress with quick, nervous hands. Her voice came out too bright and too thin, like she was reading off a script she had rehearsed for years. "Walter, you cannot just take him like that. This is a family dinner. We should not be making rash decisions." My grandfather did not even look at her. His gaze stayed on my father, who still sat frozen with his wine glass, his lips pressed so tight they had turned pale. Mark finally set the glass down, but his fingers trembled. "Dad," he said, "let us not escalate things. Evan has been doing fine. He likes living independently. There is no need to uproot everything tonight." Something snapped inside me. Fine, independent. Words they used to justify leaving me on my own since I was 17. I felt my voice rise before I could stop it. "I have not been fine. I am barely making rent. I work 2 shifts most weeks just to keep the lights on. You knew that." My father's eyes darted toward me, then away. For a moment I saw something flicker across his face, but I could not tell if it was guilt or annoyance. Walter turned sharply toward him. "You told me he had moved into the property, that he was settling in well. You sent me photos, smiling photos, Christmas decorations, a room that was supposed to be his." Linda let out a weak laugh. "Oh, those pictures. We were only trying to show you that things were going smoothly here. No need to worry about old houses and paperwork. You know how stressful these things can be for young people." She aimed a quick smile at me, but her eyes were cold, warning me to keep quiet. My grandfather leaned forward slightly, his jaw tightening. "Linda," he said, "do not insult me or him. Someone lied, and I want to know who, too." My father's face cracked then. A thin line of sweat appeared along his hairline. His voice dropped to a low defensive tone. "You are acting like I stole something. It was a trust fund. I managed it. There were complications, legal delays, paperwork. It was easier to keep things centralized. It is not as big of a deal as you are making it." Walter stared at him as if he had just spoken in another language. "Not a big deal. $3,200,000 meant for your son. Not a big deal." My father swallowed hard. Tyler suddenly lowered his phone, sensing things had shifted beyond repair. "Grandpa," Tyler said quietly, "I thought we were not supposed to mention that. Dad said it would confuse Evan and make him feel pressured. He told us not to bring it up around him." Linda whipped her head toward Tyler. eyes wide with panic. She hissed his name like a warning, but it was too late. The words were out, hanging heavy above the table. Walter nodded slowly. So there it is. My father stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly. He pointed at Tyler. You misunderstood. You always twist things. I never said that. You do not know what you are talking about. Tyler shrank back, his mouth opening slightly, confusion clouding his face, and for the first time since I arrived, I felt something unexpected tug at me. Tyler might have been the favored child, but he looked scared, too young to understand the scale of what was unraveling. Mark turned back to Walter. Dad, you cannot take everything at face value. I am handling things. Evan is doing fine. We can sort this out next week. Tonight is not the time. Walter's voice was sharp enough to cut through the air. Tonight is exactly the time. My father flinched like he had been struck. Linda pressed her fingers to her temples, whispering that this was all a misunderstanding. But no matter how many words she spilled, none of them could cover the truth that was already spreading across the room. My grandfather stepped closer to me. His expression softened just a fraction. Evan, tell me, did you receive a single letter, email, phone call, anything at all about the trust fund? Anything? I shook my head. Nothing. Not one thing. He nodded once. Then he looked at my father in a way I had never seen before, a look of someone realizing they no longer recognized the person standing in front of them. I trusted you, Mark, not just with money, with your son, with my daughter's memory, and you hid everything from him. My father's voice cracked. Dad, wait. You do not understand the situation. Walter cut him off, lowering his tone but not his force. Explain it then. Explain how millions of dollars disappeared from my oversight. Explain why Evan's name was removed from the property file. Explain why every document sent here vanished. Explain why you told me he had moved in when he had not. Mark's mouth opened, but no sound came out. My grandfather turned away from him as if he could not bear to look any longer. He placed a hand gently on my shoulder. Evan, go get your coat and your bag. If you have one with you, we are leaving. Linda snapped back to life, stepping forward, blocking his path slightly. Walter, please, this is not necessary. It is Christmas. Emotions are running high. You are letting this spiral. Walter did not even glance at her. He spoke to me in a steady voice. Go on, son. I nodded and started toward the hallway, my legs stiff but moving. I felt the weight of every eye on my back. Just as I reached this corner, my father's voice rose behind me, desperate and edged with anger. Evan, do not leave like this. You do not understand the pressure I have been under. I did what I had to do for this family. I turned slowly. For once, I let him see the disappointment that had been building for years. I am part of this family too. At least I thought I was. He stepped forward, reaching as if he could pull the words back. Evan, wait, listen to me. Linda grabbed his arm. Let him go, Mark. He is emotional, that is all. He will come back when he calms down. He always does. Something inside me finally clicked into place. I looked at them and realized that no matter how hard I had tried, I had never been seen as anything but an inconvenience. Something to be managed, something to be silenced. I turned away before either of them could add anything else and walked down the hall to get my coat from the hook near the laundry room. The house felt tighter somehow, like the walls were closing in. Every step I took made my heart thud a little harder. When I returned to the dining room with my coat in hand, my grandfather was already standing by the door. Mark and Linda stood frozen at the table, as if they were still trying to calculate the extent of what had just slipped out of their control. Walter nodded to me gently. Ready. I took a breath, then another. Yeah, I am ready. We stepped out into the cold night. The snow was still falling, white flakes swirling in the glow of the porch light. For a moment I hesitated on the threshold, feeling the shift between the life I had known and whatever was waiting beyond the frozen air. Then I followed him into the dark, letting the door close behind me. Snow crunched under our shoes as we walked toward my grandfather's rental car. The cold stung my cheeks, but something inside me felt strangely steady, almost hollow, like my body was moving ahead of my thoughts. Walter opened the passenger door for me and waited until I settled in before closing it gently. He walked around to the driver's side without a word. The engine hummed to life, warm air beginning to push through the vents while the windshield slowly cleared. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. Bethlehem's quiet streets stretched out ahead of us, lined with dark houses wrapped in wreaths and blinking lights. It should have felt festive, but all I could think about were the voices echoing from inside my father's dining room. The way Linda tried to spin lies into something pretty. The way Mark stared at his wine glass as if he could hide in it. The way Tyler looked at me, not quite understanding but aware that something impossible had cracked open. Walter drove with both hands tight on the wheel, his jaw set in a way I had not seen since I was very young. I watched the passing lights reflect faintly off his face. There were lines there I had never noticed before. Maybe they had always been there, or maybe tonight had carved them deeper. I finally spoke, my voice low. "I am sorry this happened." He shook his head immediately. "Do not apologize. You did nothing wrong." I hesitated. I should have asked more questions. I should have reached out to you more often. Maybe I would have noticed something. He let out a slow breath, not angry, simply worn down. "I should have come sooner. I should have checked on you myself instead of trusting the updates your father sent. That is on me, not on you." I looked back at the glowing windows of my father's house as they disappeared behind the trees. Part of me felt numb, but another part, a buried one, felt a strange sense of release. Like a splinter I had lived with for years had finally been pulled out, and the wound could start to close. We turned onto the main road, and the motion of the car lulled me into the quiet space in my mind, where memories began to push forward without asking permission. They came not as soft impressions, but as scenes, blunt and clear. I remembered the winter after my mother died. I was 8. The snow had piled up against the back door, and the whole house felt colder without her gentle voice. My father stayed at work until late most nights. When he was home, he spoke little, moving through the rooms like a ghost. At that age, I did not understand grief, only the empty spaces it left behind. Then came the summer he married Linda. I remembered the way she looked at me the first time we met, a polite smile that never reached her eyes. She moved into the house with a kind of swift control, rearranging furniture, repainting rooms, replacing the things my mother once touched. Within weeks, she had moved me upstairs into the small attic space, saying the bigger bedroom would be better for Tyler when he arrived. I did not argue. I did not think I was allowed to. Walter turned onto the highway. The tires hissed against the damp pavement. He glanced at me briefly. "You are quiet. What is going through your mind?" I kept my gaze on the road ahead, just thinking about how things became what they are. "You grew up in a house that did not treat you right. That is what happened." There was no anger in his tone, only sorrow. I let another memory rise. My father holding a letter, my name written neatly across it. I remembered reaching for it, curious, but Linda was faster. She plucked it from his hands and told me it was nothing important. Some school advertisement or catalog. She tossed it in the kitchen drawer. Weeks later, I found it torn in half in the trash. At the time, I did not know what to make of it. I simply learned to stop asking. I closed my eyes for a moment. "Grandpa, did you really send things before now? Letters or anything like that?" "Yes, a few. Nothing as large as the trust fund. But I tried to stay connected even after your father moved you away from Seattle. I thought he was passing them along. I never realized they were being hidden." I swallowed hard. It explained more than I wanted it to. There was a pause before he spoke again. His voice thickened with regret. "If your mother were here, she would never have let this happen. She loved you with her whole heart. I should have been closer. I should have watched more carefully after she passed." I opened my eyes. "Grandpa, it is not your fault." He gave a faint, humorless smile. "Maybe not entirely, but some part is. I trusted your father to do right by you. Tonight proved I was wrong." The car continued its steady hum down the interstate, streetlights stretching into golden blurs. Outside, the snow slowed to soft drifting flakes. Inside, the warmth from the heater finally started to sink into my hands. I let myself think back to the years when I believed the treatment I received was normal. The way Linda praised Tyler's smallest efforts, but brushed off my biggest ones. The way my father bought him a new bike when he turned 12, while I fixed one from a yard sale. The time I asked if he could attend my school awards ceremony, and he said he had a late meeting. He never made it to a single one. I never told Walter any of it. I did not want to sound ungrateful or dramatic. I thought maybe the problem was me. Maybe if I worked harder or stayed quieter or needed less, things would change, but they never did. And now, sitting beside him in the quiet car, I realized for the first time that none of it had ever been my fault. Walter spoke again after a long pause. "When we get back to the hotel, we will make plans. I want you to have a fresh start. Whatever you need. But there is something I want you to know right now. You are not alone anymore. You never should have been." His voice was steady, but filled with something raw. It pulled at something in my chest, something I had kept locked away for too long. I nodded, unable to speak for a moment. "Thank you," I finally managed. He gave a small nod in return. "Rest for a bit if you want. It is a long drive and we have an early flight." I leaned back in the seat and watched the lights flicker past the windows. The confusion, the anger, the disbelief of the evening still swirled inside me. But beneath all of it was a quiet resolve I had never felt before. The life I had known was behind me now. Whatever came next would not look anything like the years I had survived. We drove deeper into the night, leaving the only home I had ever known and heading towards something I had not dared imagine. The road stretched ahead, dark and open, and I let the hum of the engine steady my breath while the last fragments of my old life slipped away behind us. Morning light was just beginning to streak across the sky when we reached the small hotel on the edge of Allentown. I had barely slept during the drive. My head felt packed with questions and half-formed memories, and even the warm hotel room could not quiet them. Walter walked me to the door, waited until I stepped inside, then told me to rest. We would catch the early flight and talk more in Seattle. I nodded and thanked him again, though I still was not sure how any of this was real. I lay on the bed without taking off my jacket and stared at the ceiling. The silence in the room felt different from the silence in my father's house. It was not cold or hostile. It was the kind that comes before a truth you did not know you were missing. I closed my eyes, but sleep did not come. My mind kept replaying the scene at the dining table, the way my father had flinched, the way Linda had scrambled to smooth over the lies, and the way Tyler had spoken without understanding the weight of what he was saying. By the time the alarm buzzed an hour later, the sky had lightened to a dull gray. I forced myself up, splashed water on my face, and met Walter in the lobby. He had 2 cups of coffee in hand. He offered me one, and we walked toward the shuttle that would take us to the airport. We barely talked during the flight. He read through a folder of documents. I stared out the window at the clouds, trying to imagine what Seattle would feel like after all these years. When we finally landed and picked up our bags, Walter walked slowly, as if he was thinking through each next step. Outside, the air was crisp and the sky was a brighter blue than I expected. Seattle had always been a distant memory for me, a place I left when I was still small enough to believe the world made sense. Now it felt like stepping back into a story I never finished. We drove straight to Hale Mansion. I had not seen it since I was 5. I remembered pieces of it, flashes of marble floors and high ceilings, but I was not prepared for what came into view as the car turned past the gate. The house rose above the trees, tall and elegant, the kind of place you see in magazines but never imagine walking into. Walter parked near the front and gave me a soft nod to follow him. Inside, the warmth enveloped me immediately. A sweeping staircase curved upward, and the living room stretched wide with tall windows opening to a garden that glowed faintly in the winter light. It was beautiful, almost overwhelming, but Walter did not linger. He led me straight to his study. Papers were already waiting on the desk. "Sit down for a moment," he said. "There is something we need to go over before anything else." I sat across from him, hands resting on my knees. He opened a leather folder and pulled out a set of documents, each stamped and neatly organized. He flipped through them as he spoke. "This is the trust fund I created for you 2 years ago. $3.2 million. You were supposed to receive access after a short transition period. I sent the paperwork to the address your father provided. I authorized him to help you sign what was needed, since you were still using their home address. He said everything was being handled." My throat tightened. I could barely breathe. Walter slid a page toward me. My eyes went straight to the signature line. My name was there, written in a slanted style that was nothing like mine. I had never seen this paper before. I had never signed anything. I felt something cold settle in my chest. My voice came out thin. "This is not my signature." Walter nodded once. "I know. I suspected as much when you told me you had never heard about the trust, but I needed to see your reaction for myself." He picked up another sheet. This one listed the property connected to the trust, a modern estate near Kirkland, Washington. A place with enough space for a family, enough beauty to make a person feel like life was full of possibilities. The property was intended for you, he said. A fresh start, a place where you would not have to worry about whether you could pay rent. A place worthy of everything your mother wanted for you. My chest ached. The idea that such a home existed for me, meant for me, but had been kept hidden, was almost too much to process. Walter tapped the corner of the document with a steady finger. Your father reported to me that you had moved in. He even sent pictures of the house decorated for the holidays, saying you were settling well. I blinked hard. Those photos, in the dining room, the ones that felt staged. None of them looked like someone actually lived there. Now I understood why. He continued, his voice heavy. If we are going to make things right, I need you to remember something. Think back to the last couple of years. Anything strange about the mail you received? Anything missing? I leaned back slightly as the memory returned. Sharp and unsettling. A folded envelope with Seattle printed on the corner. Linda snatching it from the counter, saying it was junk mail, saying she would toss it for me. Back then I thought nothing of it. It had happened several times. I told Walter what I remembered. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he sat back in his chair and let out a long breath. It fits everything, he said quietly. Your signature was never needed for him to intercept documents. And to activate the trust under false pretenses, he would only need enough identifying information, most of which he already had. His voice turned heavier. I did not want this to be true, Evan, but your father withheld everything. He misled me, and he kept you from a life that should have been yours from the start. I ran a hand over my face, trying to steady myself. There was anger, yes, but beneath that was grief. Grief for all the years lost. Grief for the things I never knew could have been mine. For the belief that struggling alone meant I had somehow failed. It was a strange thing to realize. Your life had been shaped by someone else's choices, and that they had chosen the worst possible road for you. Walter stood and walked to the window. He looked out at the garden, hands clasped behind his back. There is more, he said quietly. Before your mother passed, she talked to me about things she wanted for you, plans she made, little dreams she hoped I could help you reach if anything ever happened to her. I never imagined I would fail to protect them. I waited, unsure if I should speak. He turned back to me. Your mother would want you to know the truth. All of it. Starting now. He sat again, eyes fixed on me with a steadiness that grounded me. Starting today, we take back what is yours. But before we move forward legally, I need you to be honest with me. Has your father ever allowed you access to any documents in your name? Anything regarding finances, education, property? I shook my head. Nothing. Never. He nodded again, as if confirming something he had already suspected. Then we know what we are dealing with. He closed the folder gently, not with anger, but with purpose. Rest for a bit. You have been through a lot. Later today, I will take you to the estate that belongs to you. You deserve to see it with your own eyes. After that, we will start figuring out exactly how far your father went. He stood, signaling that our conversation was over for now. The room felt too full and too quiet all at once. I stepped out into the hallway, still trying to breathe through the rush of emotions. The floor beneath me felt solid, yet I felt like I was learning how to walk again, like I had stepped into a version of my life that should have existed long ago. I paused near the staircase, gripping the railing lightly, letting the weight of everything settle without crashing down. The truth was finally in front of me, and the pieces of my past, the ones I never understood, were beginning to come together in a way that changed everything. I took a slow breath, feeling the ground return beneath my feet as I prepared for whatever came next. The carpet felt soft under my shoes as I stood there gripping the railing, trying to steady myself. I stayed like that for a moment, breathing in the scent of polished wood and something faintly floral drifting through the hallway. The sound of footsteps came from behind me, slow and measured. I turned to see Walter stepping out of his study. His face looked calmer now, as if deciding on a path had eased some of the weight he was carrying. Come on, Evan, he said gently. Let us get some air. There is something I want you to see. I followed him downstairs and out to the driveway, where his sedan waited. The cold Seattle air wrapped around me, sharper than in Pennsylvania, but strangely invigorating. I climbed into the passenger seat, and Walter drove us out past tall evergreens and winding streets lined with quiet winter lawns. We traveled in silence for a few minutes until the city thinned and an expanse of open sky appeared ahead. We turned into a residential area near Kirkland. The houses grew larger, more spaced out, elegant without being flashy. Walter slowed the car as we approached a gated property with stone pillars and black iron fencing. A keypad was mounted near the entrance. "This is it," he said. The gate opened after he entered a code, and the car rolled forward down a curved driveway. My breath caught slightly as the estate came into view. Soft tan siding, a tall entryway with timbers that reminded me of mountain lodges, wide windows overlooking a small slope leading to a row of fir trees. It did not feel cold or imposing. It felt like a place someone could actually live, a place where mornings might feel lighter than the ones I had known. Walter parked near the front and stepped out, waiting for me. I joined him, feeling the crunch of gravel under my shoes. The house rose above me, beautiful and calm, nothing like the cramped apartment in Bethlehem or the tense rooms of my father's home. I walked a little ahead without meaning to. When I reached the front steps, I hesitated. Placing a hand on the railing, I half expected the door to be locked to me, or for someone to tell me to stop, that I was trespassing. Walter reached out and touched my shoulder. "This is yours. Not a metaphor, not someday. It belongs to you." I let out a quiet breath. I had never imagined a sentence like that would be spoken to me. He unlocked the door and we stepped inside. Warm light filled the entryway from skylights above. The floors were smooth oak, and the living room opened to the left with a wide stone fireplace. Everything was empty, untouched, waiting. I moved slowly from room to room, my footsteps almost too loud in the stillness. A loft looked down over the main floor, and beyond the kitchen, tall windows revealed a small patio and a line of trees that shimmered faintly in the winter sun. I reached the kitchen island and ran my hand across the cool granite. It felt strange to touch something meant for me. I had spent most of my life adapting to spaces that belonged to other people. This was the first time a place felt like it might fit. Walter leaned against the doorway, watching me but not interrupting. When I finally looked up, he nodded toward the sliding doors. "Go check the back if you want. Take your time." I stepped outside. The air was crisp, but the sunlight softened the cold. A small stone path led toward a slope behind the house. I followed it until I reached the farthest point where the property bordered a cluster of tall fir trees. From there I could see the city in the distance, faint outlines of buildings softened by a thin mist. For a moment I let myself picture a life here, waking up in a warm room, coming home to quiet instead of tension, studying for classes at a kitchen table that did not wobble, leaving the store job behind, opening windows without worrying the frame might fall apart. I felt something rise in my chest. A slow, steady warmth that surprised me. Hope. It had been a long time. I turned back to the house. Walter was standing at the doors now, waiting for me to return. I made my way to him, brushing cold air from my hands as I stepped inside. "It is incredible," I said, still trying to find words. "I do not know what to say." "You do not have to say anything," he replied. "I want you to see what was meant for you, what your mother wanted." This was not about luxury. It was about stability, a place where you would not have to fight for every inch. A flicker of sadness crossed his face. Then he straightened slightly and motioned toward the living room. "Sit with me a moment. We need to talk through a few things. Nothing heavy, just plans." I followed him to a pair of chairs near the fireplace. He lowered himself into one and waited until I sat down across from him. For the first time since leaving Pennsylvania, he looked tired, not physically, but in the way someone looks when they have carried a truth alone for too long. "Evan," he said quietly, "I want you to stay here for a few days. Get familiar with the place. Feel what it is like to be somewhere that is actually yours. Then we can talk about the company and the next steps." I nodded. "That sounds good." He hesitated before continuing. "There is something I should explain so that none of this catches you off guard. My brother Martin is vice president at Hale Structures. He is intelligent and capable, but he has been restless. The board knows I am nearing retirement age, and there are people positioning themselves for change. Martin is among them. He will be polite to you, but he will not be pleased that you are back in Seattle, let alone involved in anything with the company." I absorbed that slowly. I did not even work there yet. But already there were people who might see me as a threat. After everything with my father, the idea of more tension felt heavy. But this was different. These were people I did not know. Their opinions did not carry the same weight. Walter continued, "You do not need to worry about him. Just be aware, when the time is right, you will come with me to the office. I want you to learn how the business works. You do not have to commit to anything now. I want you to explore your options. But you belong in Seattle, not struggling alone in a town that never protected you." He paused, and the quiet stretched softly between us. The room felt warm, with the faint crackle of the heater in the background. "I want to make this right, Evan, whatever it takes." I looked around at the house again, then back at him. It had been years since anyone had spoken to me with that kind of conviction. I felt something tighten inside me, not painful, but fragile. "Thank you," I said. He nodded once, accepting the words without brushing them away. We stood a little while later and walked toward the front door. The afternoon light was beginning to fade, turning the hallway golden. Walter paused near the entry table. "I have a meeting this evening with an attorney. I think it is time we start understanding exactly what your father did. For now, stay here, rest. This place is safe." I watched him step outside and close the door behind him. The house fell into a quiet so deep I could hear my own breathing. I walked to the center of the living room and stood there, letting my eyes adjust to the stillness. For the first time in my life, I was inside a home meant for me. A home no one could take away with a single decision or a raised voice. The weight of everything settled in slowly, not crushing, but grounding, and I let myself breathe in the reality of this new threshold. I stayed there until the last light faded across the floor, and the room slipped into evening shadows. Evening settled over the house slowly, turning the windows into faint mirrors. I stood there for a while longer, letting the quiet steady me, until a soft vibration in my pocket pulled me back. I reached for my phone and saw a message from a number I had not thought about in years. Deborah Campbell, my old neighbor from Bethlehem, the woman who used to bring cookies during the holidays back when my mother was alive. I stared at the name for a long moment before opening the message. "Evan, it is Deborah. I need to talk to you. It is important about your mother." I felt a prick of cold spread through my chest. I typed back asking if she was all right. Her reply came quickly. "I found something that belonged to her. You should hear this from me. Could we talk tomorrow?" I glanced around the dim living room, then sank onto the couch. For years, I had learned to manage memories of my mother carefully, keeping them tucked away so they did not hurt as much. Now one message had pulled them forward again. I answered that I could talk by phone anytime, but she wanted it to be face-to-face. She would be in Seattle, visiting her niece for a few days. She could meet me in the morning. After we settled the details, I set my phone down and leaned my head back. The quiet of the house pressed in again, but it did not feel uncomfortable. It felt expectant, like something had shifted and was waiting for what came next. The next morning, the sky was bright and pale, washed with the thin winter sun. I got up early and made coffee in the empty kitchen, listening to the heater hum to life. The house still felt too big for just me, but the warmth was beginning to feel familiar. By the time I finished my mug, it was time to leave. I drove Walter's spare car into the city, passing rows of pines and glimpses of the water in the distance. Seattle had a quiet way of carrying its own light. Even on cold mornings like this, the city felt awake. Deborah had asked me to meet her at a small cafe near Green Lake. When I stepped inside, I found her sitting near the window. Her hair had grayed since I last saw her, but her eyes were the same, kind but sharp, like she had learned long ago that life rarely made sense all at once. She rose as I approached, her arms opening slightly. I stepped into her hug without thinking, surprised by how grounding it felt. "Oh, Evan," she said softly, "you look so much like your mother now." I swallowed against the tightness in my throat. "Thank you for reaching out." We sat down, and she took a careful sip of her tea before setting the cup aside. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small wooden box. The edges were worn, as if it had been held many times by someone unsure whether to open it. "I have kept this for years," she said. "Your mother left it with a friend of hers just before you moved away. The friend moved a short time later and passed it to me because she did not know who else to contact. I thought your father would pick it up, but he never did. And then time went on, and I held on to it, waiting for the right moment. After everything that happened recently, I felt I needed to find you. My fingers brushed the surface of the box before I opened it. Inside were several envelopes, some yellowed at the edges. A small notebook lay beneath them, bound with a thin ribbon. I lifted the first envelope. My mother's handwriting was unmistakable, slanted, neat, gentle. I hesitated. Deborah reached out and touched my wrist. "Take your time." I unfolded the letter slowly. The paper crackled softly. Her words felt like they reached across the years, straight into the quiet spaces inside me. She wrote about feeling overwhelmed, about trying to keep the house together after my father pulled away emotionally, about her fear that if anything ever happened to her, I might end up lost in the tension between them. She wrote about wanting my grandfather to guide me if she could not. She wrote that she trusted him. She wrote that she worried my father did not know how to see me for who I was. And near the end, she said that if the worst happened, certain documents needed to be kept safe for me, things she worried my father might hide. She mentioned a trust account she had begun discussing with Walter, something I never knew about, something she hoped would protect me. When I finally lowered the letter, the cafe had grown quieter, my throat felt thick, and I blinked several times to steady my vision. Deborah watched me with concern. "There is more," she said gently. "Look in the notebook." I lifted the small notebook, untied the ribbon, and opened it. It was filled with short entries, some about me as a baby, my first steps, my first words. Others described things I no longer remembered. Walks around the neighborhood, the blanket she liked to wrap around me, but in the last pages her handwriting became shakier. She wrote about tension with Linda, how she felt pushed aside in her own home, how Linda talked about rearranging rooms and changing routines, how she feared being replaced. The final entry mentioned that she believed Linda had gone through her mail, that she had found opened envelopes, that she no longer felt she could trust anyone in the house except me, who was too young to help. I closed the notebook slowly. It felt like holding a heartbeat that had been quiet for years. Deborah reached into her bag again. "There is one more thing," she said. She handed me a small metal key wrapped in tissue. I recognized it immediately. A safe deposit key. My mother had kept one in the house when I was small. My father once said it was nothing important, just papers she liked to store. I never questioned it. "Your mother left instructions for her friend," Deborah said. "The box was tied to this key, but I never knew the bank. Her friend mentioned a branch downtown, local to Seattle. She did not remember the name." I held the key in my palm, cold, solid, part of a past I thought had vanished. "Thank you," I said quietly. "You did not have to keep this for so long." She gave a small nod. "Your mother was a good woman. She loved you more than anything. She did not deserve what happened, and you deserve the truth she tried to protect." For a few minutes we sat without speaking. The morning sun brightened the window. People walked past the cafe, bundled in coats, talking and laughing. Life moving on outside while mine felt suspended in the space between memory and revelation. Eventually I stood and pulled in a steady breath. I should get this key checked. Maybe the box does not exist anymore. Maybe it does. Either way, I need to know. Deborah squeezed my hand. "If you need anything, you call me. All right?" I promised I would. Then stepped back into the cold air. The sky had shifted to a deeper blue, and the wind carried the smell of pine. I held the small key in my pocket the whole walk back to the car, feeling its weight, its meaning. It was the first tangible piece of my mother I had touched in almost 2 decades. I sat behind the wheel for a long moment, staring at my hands. The trust fund, the house, the letters, the key. None of it felt separate anymore. Threads of a story that had been hidden from me were pulling together, forming a truth that reached beyond betrayal and into the last protections my mother tried to leave behind. I started the engine slowly, knowing exactly where I needed to go next. I headed toward downtown Seattle, the metal key still warm from being pressed inside my palm. Traffic was light, and the morning sun broke through clouds in thin silver streaks, bright against the wet pavement. I tried to steady my breathing as the buildings grew taller around me. Everything felt sharper than usual. The colors, the sounds, even the rhythm of my heartbeat. My mother had left something behind, something meant for me, and my father had made sure I never knew. I found a parking spot near an old brick bank on Pine Street. The building looked older than everything around it, like it had refused to leave even as the city transformed. I sat for a moment before going inside, trying to calm the flutter under my ribs. When I finally stepped through the doors, warm air washed over me along with the scent of paper and polished counters. A woman in her 60s looked up from behind the reception desk, her glasses positioned low on her nose. She smiled. "Can I help you with something?" I nodded and held out the key. "I am trying to locate a safe deposit box tied to this. I believe it belonged to my mother years ago. I am not sure if it is still active." She took the key carefully, examined the number, then typed something into her computer. Her eyebrows lifted. "This is quite an old account. It was last accessed in early 2010. Yes, we still hold this box." A soft pressure tightened around my chest. That was the same year my mother died. I forced my voice steady. "Would it be possible to open it today?" "It will take just a moment to confirm your authorization," she said, and she asked for my identification. After a few minutes, she returned with a small set of binder documents. "Everything seems to be in order. If you follow me, I will take you downstairs." We walked into a narrow hallway, then through a heavy steel door that opened with a soft mechanical buzz. The vault room was chilled, quiet, lined with small metal doors. She stopped at one near the corner and gestured. "This is box 412. I will leave you alone once it is open." She slid the key in, turned it, and gently pulled the drawer outward. "Let me know when you are done." When she stepped out, I reached for the drawer with both hands and slid it onto the table. My breath shook slightly as I lifted the lid. Inside was a single envelope and a slim stack of documents bound with a ribbon. The envelope had my name on it, written in my mother's familiar looping script. I sat down and held it for a moment, letting the weight of that handwriting settle in my chest. Then I opened it. Her voice came back to me through her words so clearly that my vision blurred. She wrote about wanting to give me something she could not give in person. She wrote that she feared my father had grown distant, that she sensed Linda pressing into spaces that used to belong to her. She worried that decisions about our future were being made without her. She wanted this box to serve as a safeguard, a place where I would find the truth when I was old enough to understand it. Beneath the envelope was a set of legal papers, a preliminary trust agreement between her and my grandfather, drafts of property plans, notes in the margins in her handwriting, a list of financial assets that she had intended to shift into my name when I turned 18. All of it unfinished, all of it hidden. I let out a slow breath and leaned back, closing my eyes. She had tried to protect me even when she felt herself fading, and my father had let it disappear. After a few minutes, I gathered everything, placed it back into the box, and carried it upstairs. The receptionist helped me make copies, then sealed the originals in a new envelope before returning the drawer to the vault. I thanked her, then walked outside into the cold air. The sky hung low with gray clouds, the wind brushing against me softly. I unlocked the car and got in, letting my forehead rest against the steering wheel. There was anger in me, yes, but underneath it was something deeper, heavier, a grief that felt sharpened by the years I had been kept from these pieces of her. My phone buzzed suddenly. It was a call from an unknown number. I answered, thinking it might be Walter's attorney. A man's voice came through, deep and smooth. "Evan Hale, this is Richard Ward. Your grandfather asked me to reach out. We would like to meet with you at his office this afternoon, if you are available." I exhaled slowly. "Yes, I am available. Where should I go?" He gave me the address in downtown Seattle. The call was brief and professional. When it ended, I sat for a few moments, steadying myself. Then I started the car and drove toward Hale Structures. Traffic grew thicker as I entered the business district. The company building rose tall and polished among the others. I parked in the underground lot and took the elevator up to the 11th floor, where the main offices were. The doors opened to a spacious lobby lined with modern wood paneling and clean glass partitions. A receptionist greeted me and directed me toward a conference room. When I walked inside, Walter was already seated at the head of the table. Next to him was a tall man in his late 50s with silver hair and sharp eyes behind rectangular glasses. His suit looked expensive but understated. He rose as I entered. "You must be Evan. I am Richard Ward. It is good to finally meet you." We shook hands. Richard motioned for me to sit. Walter gave me a small nod. but his expression was serious. Richard opened a binder. Let us begin with what we know. Your father activated the trust using forged signatures. He intercepted legal documents addressed to you, and he misrepresented your circumstances to your grandfather. We also have evidence that he used the trust property allocation for his own advantage. These are not minor matters. I swallowed, my hands tensing under the table. What happens now? Richard folded his hands. There are 2 tracks, criminal and civil. Criminal charges would involve the state pursuing him for fraud. Civil charges would be you reclaiming what is rightfully yours. It is up to you which direction we pursue. My pulse quickened. Walter spoke before I could respond. You do not have to decide this moment, but you do need to understand the scope. Your father crossed several legal boundaries, and there will be consequences. Richard nodded. There is also a second matter, internal to the company. I looked up sharply. Your Uncle Martin has been positioning himself for more authority within Hale structures. He has recently questioned Walter's capacity to continue as CEO. The board is split, and Martin has been quietly leveraging certain relationships. Nothing illegal from what we can see, but the timing is delicate. Your arrival complicates things for him. I frowned slightly. Complicates how? Richard turned a page in his binder. Because you represent the line of succession your grandfather intended. Martin is aware of this. He will not act against you directly, at least not yet. But he will not welcome your involvement. I felt something settle under my ribs. A different kind of tension from the one involving my father. This was colder, more strategic. It reminded me that betrayal did not exist only inside families. It could stretch into boardrooms, hidden behind polite smiles. Walter spoke quietly. You need to know the truth so you can stand on solid ground. No surprises. Not again. I nodded slowly. I appreciate that. Richard closed the binder. I suggest we take this one step at a time. First, we will reclaim your trust and correct the ownership records. Then, you will decide how to proceed regarding your father. After that, we can discuss your role in the company, if that is something you want. The room fell quiet for a moment. Walter leaned back slightly, studying me. How are you feeling, son? All of this is a lot. I looked down at my hands, then at the envelope in my pocket, holding my mother's handwriting. The last messages she had left for me. When I looked up again, something had shifted inside me. A steadying, a clarity I had not had before. I am ready to move forward. Walter nodded with something like pride. Richard offered a small approving smile. Good, Richard said. Then we begin today. I exhaled slowly, knowing this was only the start of what lay ahead. My past had finally caught up with me, and now I had to decide what to do with the truth it carried. The meeting ended, and I stepped into the hallway. The floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the city stretching out below, shimmering under the winter sky. I stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of everything that awaited me. I took a breath and began walking toward the elevator, preparing myself for the next step. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, and I stepped inside, feeling the cool metal of the rail beneath my hand as the doors closed. The ride down was silent except for the faint hum of machinery. My reflection hovered in the polished steel surface, faint and uncertain. For a moment I studied the outline of my face, realizing how different I looked from the boy my father had raised. Stronger, maybe, or simply less willing to disappear. By the time I reached the ground floor, my phone vibrated. A Pennsylvania number. I hesitated before answering. A hollow voice came through. Evan, it is Tyler. I stopped walking. He sounded small, almost a whisper. I am sorry to call you. I know everything is a mess. I just wanted to hear your voice. I found a quiet corner near the building's entrance and leaned against the wall. What is going on? He let out a shaky breath. Dad lost his job. Mom has been arguing with everyone. Bills are piling up. He said you are turning the whole family upside down. I closed my eyes briefly. Tyler, I am not turning anything. I am fixing what should never have been broken. He sniffed. I know. I think I know. I just do not understand any of this. And Dad will not talk. A hollow ache stirred in my chest. Tyler was 19, technically an adult, but in many ways still a kid sheltered by lies. I softened my voice. This is not your fault. And you do not owe anyone an explanation for what your parents did. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that caught me off guard. Evan, I think Mom knew. She always said things that did not make sense, like you should not ask about mail or money. She said you would not understand grown-up things. But now I think she meant something else. I felt my grip tighten around the phone. What exactly did she say? She told me once that some things were better if you never found out, that if people knew too much, they would ruin everything. I did not know what she meant, but she sounded nervous. The words hit something deep in me, validating everything I had suspected. Before I could respond, Tyler's voice wavered. Are you going to destroy us, Evan? For a moment I had no words. Then I said quietly, I am not trying to destroy anyone, but the truth has consequences. And those consequences are happening because of choices your parents made, not mine. He let out a soft tremor of breath. I guess I just wanted to hear you say you do not hate me. I exhaled slowly. I do not hate you. He made a small sound that might have been a quiet cry. Then he whispered goodbye and hung up. I stood there for another minute before stepping out into the cold. The sky had turned slate gray again. Seattle winters always seem to shift moods as quickly as people. When I reached the car, I saw a missed call from Walter and a short message. Come home when you can. We will discuss next steps. But before I could start the engine, another thought surfaced. Something quieter, but insistent. I needed to check on my father's house. I needed to see what state they were actually in. Not out of pity, but because a part of me wanted to see who they were without the lies, without the comfort of money that was never theirs. I made the drive back to my estate near Kirkland first, picking up the folder of documents Richard had printed for me. Then I sat for a long time at the kitchen island, flipping through them absent-mindedly. Every page painted the same picture: misuse, deception, signatures that were not mine. Choices my father had made to secure a life for himself and his new family at the expense of mine. It was the kind of wrongdoing that left a stain deep enough that even forgiveness could not wash it clean. Hours later, I found myself pulling into the driveway of my father's Pennsylvania home after an overnight flight. A thin layer of snow covered the sidewalk. The house looked smaller than I remembered, dimmer, as if the life inside it had shrunk to match the truth behind its walls. I knocked once, then again. After a long moment, I heard slow shuffling. The door opened, revealing my father, unshaven, his eyes red as if he had not slept for days. He stared at me like he could not decide whether to shut the door or collapse. Evan, what are you doing here? I stepped inside without waiting. The living room was cluttered, boxes stacked near the wall, unopened mail scattered across the coffee table. Linda sat on the couch with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, looking smaller somehow, as if guilt had carved away her confidence. Neither of them spoke at first. My father finally lowered himself into a chair, his hands trembling faintly. Your phone call to Tyler, he said quietly. He has been upset for hours. You had no right to bring him into this. My jaw tightened. I did not call Tyler. He called me, and this situation touches everyone. You made sure of that. Linda lifted her head. Her voice cracked. We were trying to protect the family. The family. I repeated the words quietly. The same words you used when you took everything away from me. She looked down, lips trembling. I walked closer, placing the folder of documents on the coffee table. They both stared at it as if it might explode. I did not raise my voice. I did not have to. This is what you did. These are the signatures you forged. These are the letters you hid. And this is the trust you kept from me while I worked 2 jobs and lived in a place you would not have let Tyler visit. My father ran a hand over his face. Shoulders slumped. I thought I could manage it. I thought you did not want help. I thought you would waste it. My voice tightened. It was not yours to decide. Silence filled the room like cold smoke. Linda's eyes filled with tears. My father looked at the floor, beaten in a way I had never seen before. After a long moment, he whispered, What happens now? I felt a strange calm wash over me. The decision was already made back in Seattle. There will be a legal case. Richard will handle it. I will not pursue criminal charges. But everything tied to me comes back to me. That is non-negotiable. Linda broke into a soft sob. My father nodded slowly, acceptance settling into his posture like a weight he could no longer fight. I picked up the folder, turned toward the door, and walked away without saying more. Their voices did not follow me. They did not ask me to stay. For the first time, they had nothing left to leverage. When I reached the car again, the air felt sharply cold against my face. Snow had begun to fall in thin drifting flakes, settling on the windshield. I sat there with my hands on the steering wheel, letting the silence wrap around me. I had seen what I came to see. The collapse had already begun without me lifting a single hand. My father had lost his job. Their finances were sliding into chaos. Tyler was scrambling to understand a world he did not know existed. And Linda no longer held the smug confidence she once had. Every lie had broken open, every hidden truth had risen, and there was still more ahead. I started the engine and pulled out of the driveway, watching the house grow smaller in the rearview mirror until the snow swallowed it completely. I kept driving until the neighborhood disappeared behind a curtain of white. The farther I got, the easier it became to breathe. By the time I reached the highway, the snowfall had softened, drifting lazily across the road, like it had no interest in where it landed. I followed the stretch of asphalt without thinking, letting the quiet rhythm of the tires settle the last of the shaking inside me. When my phone buzzed on the passenger seat, I glanced at the screen. A message from Walter. "Call me when you land. Big developments here." I exhaled, tightened my grip on the wheel, and headed toward the airport. Hours later, after a flight spent staring at the seat in front of me while thoughts circled like storm clouds, I was back in Seattle. Walter was waiting at the arrivals area, leaning on his cane and watching the crowd with an expression halfway between worry and determination. He spotted me and waved me over. I walked toward him, feeling the exhaustion of the last 24 hours settle behind my ribs. "How did it go?" he asked quietly. "It went the way it needed to," I said. "I saw everything for what it is." He gave a small nod. "Good. You needed closure before things move forward." We headed toward the parking garage. The air smelled faintly of jet fuel and cold metal. Once inside the car, Walter let out a long breath. "We have a situation at the company," he said. "Martin has been speaking to the board again. He wants a vote to remove me. Said something about the company needing fresh leadership." He tapped the steering wheel with 2 fingers. "Strange timing, do you not think?" I watched the faint worry cross his face. Does he know about the trust situation? He may not know the details, but he knows enough to feel threatened. Your presence puts boundaries around a power shift he has been planning for years. I felt the weight of that settle on my chest, heavy but not unfamiliar. Another betrayal, only dressed in suits instead of holiday decorations. "What do we do?" I asked. "We show them the truth," Walter replied. "About the trust and about Martin." He glanced at me, then said something I had not expected. "And tomorrow, you are coming with me to the board meeting." A spike of nerves tightened my stomach. Me? At a corporate meeting where people twice my age would judge every word I said. But then I thought of my father, of Linda, of the lies that had shaped my life. I had survived worse than a room full of executives. "All right, I will be there." The next morning arrived too quickly. I wore a clean shirt, the nicest pair of shoes I owned, and tried to smooth down the nervous energy buzzing under my skin. Walter was waiting in the foyer, dressed in a charcoal suit with a quiet confidence that matched the strength I had seen in him all week. The drive to Hale Structures was quiet, but not uncomfortable. When we reached the building, he placed a hand briefly on my shoulder. "You do not need to speak unless you want to. Just be present. That is enough." Inside the boardroom, a long, polished table stretched beneath recessed lights. Men and women in business attire filled the seats. Some greeted Walter warmly. Others nodded politely without warmth. Martin Hale stood near the windows, tall and stiff, his suit immaculate, his expression unreadable. His eyes narrowed slightly when he saw me walk in beside Walter. "So the prodigal grandson returns," he said with a hint of a smile that did not reach his eyes. I did not respond. Walter walked past him without slowing. Everyone took their seats. Martin remained standing. "Before we begin our regular agenda," he said, "I want to revisit the matter of leadership transition. Many of you know that I have concerns about the future direction of the company and whether Walter still has the capacity to lead effectively." The room tensed. Several board members shifted in their seats. Walter raised a hand. "Before we indulge Martin's ambition, I have documents to present." Martin stiffened, but Walter nodded to Richard, who had joined us moments earlier. The attorney opened a folder and addressed the room in a steady voice. "There have been financial inconsistencies in project expenses dating back to early 2022. Funds approved under the signature of Vice President Martin Hale do not align with recorded expenditures. We have traced several discrepancies into accounts unauthorized by corporate policy. A ripple of murmurs moved across the room. Martin's jaw clenched. That is a mischaracterization. These were reallocations necessary for project stability, all approved verbally. Richard adjusted his glasses. There is no record of any approval, verbal or otherwise. And these reallocations occurred during a time when Martin was lobbying for expanded authority. Martin turned sharply toward Walter. You brought this child into the company, and now you want him to be your successor. That is what this is. A stunt, a distraction. Walter's tone remained calm. My grandson has nothing to do with the irregularities in your accounting, but his return did shine light in places you preferred to keep dark. I felt a quiet shift in the room as several board members looked at me with something like curiosity mixed with calculation. Martin scoffed. He is barely out of school. What could he possibly contribute? He knows nothing about business. I met his eyes and spoke before I had time to second-guess myself. I know what happens when people take what does not belong to them. I know what damage a hidden signature can do. And I know the company deserves integrity, not secrecy. Martin's mouth tightened. For a moment, the room seemed to hold still. Richard continued, the board has the authority to place Martin on temporary suspension pending review. Given the evidence, that is our legal recommendation. One of the board members, a woman with gray hair and a stern expression, spoke up. I support suspension. The numbers do not lie. A man beside her nodded. We cannot overlook this. We vote. Within minutes, the vote concluded. Martin's face strained as the final tally was read. Suspended pending full audit. He looked furious, betrayed. But something else too, afraid. His eyes landed on me again, and for a moment I saw the same expression my father had worn the night everything fell apart. The truth had stripped the power from both of them. The meeting ended shortly after, and people began to file out. Walter stayed seated, letting the room empty before standing with effort. When he faced me, his expression softened. You did well. I let out the breath I had been holding. I do not know if I helped. You did. Being here mattered. We walked out together into the hallway. My mind felt heavy, swirling with the weight of everything that had shifted in those 40 minutes. As we reached the elevator, Walter paused. There is something you should know. The civil filing regarding your father is ready. It will be submitted today if you approve it. Nothing criminal, just recovery and correction. It is your decision. I stared at the elevator doors, watching my reflection tremble slightly in the metal surface. I want the trust returned to me, I said quietly. The property, the accounts, everything tied to my name. But I do not want to pursue criminal charges, not against my father. I do not want to drag this any further into the dark. Walter nodded. All right, that is what we will do. The doors opened, and we stepped inside. My heart felt strangely calm. Heavy, but calm. As the elevator began its slow descent, I felt something settle inside me. A realization that the storm was shifting. A sense that the ground beneath my feet was finally changing. I had reclaimed the truth, and soon, by law, I would reclaim everything else. When the doors slid open again, sunlight streamed through the tall lobby windows, bright against the marble floor as if marking the beginning of whatever came next. Sunlight warmed the lobby floor, and for a moment I just stood there, letting the brightness settle the tension in my chest. Something inside me felt steadier than it had in years. When Walter and I walked toward the doors together, he moved a little slower, but his shoulders were straighter, as if a weight he had carried quietly for too long had finally loosened. Outside, the air was crisp and clean. I pulled in a long breath and followed him to the car. We rode in comfortable silence all the way back to my estate near Kirkland. I could see the house rising through the trees as we approached and felt a strange sense of recognition, like my life had begun splitting into two directions, and I was finally choosing the one that belonged to me. Inside, Walter asked if I had a moment to talk. We sat in the living room where the afternoon light stretched across the wooden floors. He rested both hands on his cane. The civil filing has been submitted. You will receive official notice soon. The trust will be legally restored to your name, property, accounts, everything. I felt my shoulders loosen. Thank you. He shook his head slightly. I am sorry it ever had to come to this. Your mother deserved better. So did you. I let the words settle between us. There was no anger left in me, only an ache for what had been taken and a quiet gratitude for what was finally being returned. For the next few weeks, my life took on a rhythm I had never experienced before. My days began early with the soft winter light filling the rooms. I spent my mornings walking around the property, learning the way the sun shifted across the lawn, how the trees rustled when the wind moved through them. In the afternoons, I went to hail structures, shadowing different teams, studying blueprints, learning the language of the company I would one day help guide. Richard handled most of the legal processing, and each time I received an update, it felt like another piece of debris clearing from my path. In the evenings, Walter and I often sat by the fireplace. He would tell me stories about my mother, the time she convinced him to adopt a stray dog he pretended not to want, the way she used to sing while she cooked, how she talked about wanting me to have a life filled with opportunities she never had time to chase. Sometimes those stories brought tears to my eyes. Other times they stitched something inside me back together. One crisp morning in February, I woke to an email from the court confirming that the transfer of all assets was complete. The trust was officially mine. The property was legally linked to my name. My father no longer had any authority or access attached to my documents. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the message until the sunlight shifted across the room. It was over, the legal part at least. I called Walter to tell him, and he arrived within the hour. We sat on the back porch with warm coffee and blankets over our legs. He looked out across the yard, his expression thoughtful. "There is one last thing you should consider," he said. "Closure, not for them, for yourself." I knew what he meant before he clarified. A final visit to Pennsylvania, not to reopen a wound, but to close it properly. 2 weeks later, I found myself on a flight back east. When I arrived, the winter was still clinging to the landscape. Houses looked gray and tired under the clouded sky. My father's neighborhood felt smaller than before, more brittle around the edges. I parked on the street and walked slowly up the front steps. When I knocked, the door opened almost instantly, as if someone had been waiting nearby. My father stood there, leaning against the frame. He looked older than he had only a month before. His shoulders sagged, his eyes held a hollow exhaustion. He stepped aside without speaking, and I entered the house. The living room was cluttered, but less chaotic than the last time. Linda sat on the sofa, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She did not look up as I walked in. I sat on the chair across from them and waited. Finally, my father exhaled deeply. The sound was more a release than a breath. "Thank you for not pressing charges." I nodded. I said what I meant. I am not looking for revenge. He looked at his hands. "Then what are you looking for?" The question had been forming in my mind since the plane touched down. Now it felt clear. "Accountability," I said, "and distance." He closed his eyes briefly, as if he had expected those words but hoped to hear something else. I continued, "You made choices that changed my life. I will spend years repairing the damage. I do not wish you harm, but I will not pretend we are the family you always claimed we were. I am not coming back here." Linda lifted her face then, and I could see the traces of resentment mixed with shame. Maybe she wanted to argue, but she seemed tired, defeated. She only whispered, "We never meant to hurt you." I stood. Intentions do not erase actions. My father rose slowly. "Evan, I am sorry. I should have protected you. I failed." His voice trembled, and for a fleeting moment, I felt the shadow of the boy in me, who had once needed his approval more than anything. But that boy had walked away the night I left with Walter, and I was not going back to him. I gave a quiet nod, then I walked to the door. When I stepped outside, the cold air brushed my face, but it felt clean, not biting. The sky broke open with hints of pale sunlight filtering through the clouds. I walked toward the car, each step lighter than the one before. By the time I reached Seattle that evening, the city lights were glowing across the water. My house waited at the end of the long, quiet drive. When I entered, the rooms felt warmer than they ever had, like the space had finally shifted from something offered to something chosen. I unpacked my bag, brewed a cup of tea, and stood by the window looking out across the yard. The fir trees stood tall and still. The world felt unexpectedly wide and full. I had a new life. A real one built on truth instead of lies, on healing instead of hiding. My mother's hopes had found me through the years, and my grandfather's love had carried me into a future I never could have imagined. And for the first time, I felt ready to step into that future without looking back. If you have been walking with me through this story, I hope you will stay for the next chapter of my journey. Share your thoughts, subscribe if you would like to hear more stories like this, and let us keep going forward together.